In 1799, during the Napoleonic Wars, French soldiers were demolishing an old fort in the Egyptian city of Rosetta to make room for military fortifications. As they broke through a wall, they discovered a stone slab of dark granodiorite covered in 3 different kinds of writing. No one at that moment could have known that this single stone, roughly the size of a small tabletop, would become the Rosetta Stone, an object that would unlock an entire lost world, that would allow scholars to finally read the hieroglyphics that had remained silent and mysterious for nearly 2,000 years, that would open the door to understanding one of humanity's greatest civilizations and revealing secrets about Egyptian religion, government, science, literature, and daily life that had been hidden since antiquity. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone changed the intellectual history of the modern world. For nearly 2 millennia, Egyptian hieroglyphics had been visible everywhere in Egypt, but readable nowhere. Ancient Greek, Roman, and Arabic writers all acknowledged that the symbols existed and that they mattered, but no one alive could actually understand them. They were a dead script attached to a dead language, preserved in stone but sealed off from meaning. The Rosetta Stone changed that. Within a generation, scholars had used it to crack the hieroglyphic code. Within a century, an entire civilization had been brought back into human knowledge. The tombs of pharaohs could finally be understood. Religious inscriptions could be translated. Administrative decrees could be read. The history of ancient Egypt, though previously filtered through Greek and Roman writers, could now be reconstructed from Egyptian sources themselves. But what makes the Rosetta Stone truly remarkable is not simply that it helped scholars decipher hieroglyphics. It is what the stone revealed about language, translation, meaning, and the way knowledge survives or disappears across time. The Rosetta Stone did not merely unlock ancient Egypt. It revealed how fragile civilization really is, how easily entire worlds of knowledge can be lost, and how extraordinary it is when one accidental survival allows the past to speak again. For almost 2,000 years, Egyptian hieroglyphics were effectively dead to the world. That fact is more astonishing the longer you think about it. Here was one of the greatest civilizations in human history, a civilization that built the pyramids, so organized one of the longest lasting states the world has ever known, created monumental architecture on a scale that still inspires disbelief, developed advanced systems of administration, mathematics, astronomy, religion, and medicine, and filled temples, tombs, monuments, papyri, and statues with writing. Their world was not silent. It was heavily documented. They wrote constantly about kings and taxes, rituals and law, death and immortality, love and memory, offerings and war. And yet, by the medieval and early modern periods, all of that writing had become unreadable. The monuments remained. Travelers could still stand before temple walls covered in symbols. They could still enter tombs and see elegant signs carved into stone, painted across burial chambers, and copied into funerary papyri. The writing was clearly intentional, clearly complex, clearly meaningful, but no one could read it. It was like standing in front of an immense library while every book remained locked. Scholars tried to make sense of it anyway. Renaissance thinkers, fascinated by Egypt, often imagined hieroglyphics were not a normal writing system at all. Some believed they were mystical symbols rather than language. Others believed each sign represented a complete philosophical idea or cosmic truth. Some thought the script was designed specifically to conceal sacred knowledge from ordinary people. In that interpretation, hieroglyphics were not just unreadable because the language had been lost. They were unreadable because they were never meant to function like ordinary writing in the first place. That assumption would dominate for centuries, and it turned out to be one of the biggest obstacles to decipherment. Without a key, no one could know whether the script represented sounds, words, ideas, or some combination of all 3. Without a bilingual text, there was no stable way to match symbols to known meanings. Scholars could speculate endlessly, but speculation is not decipherment. It produces theories, not reading. This created an extraordinary historical irony. Ancient Egypt was one of the most famous civilizations in the world, but almost everything people believed about it came from outsiders. Greek historians like Herodotus wrote about Egyptian customs, priests, kings, and monuments. Roman writers added their own impressions. Later Arabic scholars commented on ruins and ancient traditions, but these were all external accounts. The Egyptians themselves had written endlessly about their own world, and yet their voices remained inaccessible. Imagine knowing that a civilization had left behind thousands of primary sources and still being unable to hear a single sentence in its original meaning. That was the situation before the Rosetta Stone. The reason hieroglyphics became lost was not mysterious, it was historical. Egyptian civilization lasted an astonishingly long time, but it did not last forever. Over centuries, Egypt came under Persian rule, then Greek rule after Alexander, then Roman rule. Language changed, administration changed, culture changed. Greek became increasingly dominant in elite and governmental life. Later, with the spread of Christianity and the suppression of older temple cults, as the priestly institutions that had preserved sacred writing declined. Hieroglyphics had long been associated with temples, ritual, kingship, and elite education. Once those institutions weakened or disappeared, so did the practical need to train new readers and scribes. The last known hieroglyphic inscription dates to the late 4th century AD. After that, the tradition effectively ended. The script remained in stone, but it no longer lived in minds. That distinction matters. A text survives physically when stone survives, but it survives intellectually only when someone can still read it. The Rosetta Stone's later importance depended entirely on that truth. Knowledge can remain materially present and still be functionally lost. By the early modern period, this loss created both frustration and fascination. So Egypt seemed to offer access to an unimaginably ancient world, one older than classical Greece and Rome, one surrounded by monuments of impossible scale and strange beauty. But the civilization could not speak for itself. Every column and wall seemed to contain meaning, but meaning without access is only presence, not understanding. Then in 1798, Napoleon invaded Egypt. The military campaign itself had many motives: strategic, political, imperial, but it also included a scholarly dimension. Napoleon brought with him engineers, surveyors, naturalists, linguists, and scholars. This was not just an army, it was an expedition of conquest paired with documentation. The French were not only occupying Egypt, they were measuring, cataloging, sketching, recording, and trying to comprehend it. That context made the discovery of the Rosetta Stone possible, and just as important, it ensured the object would be recognized as potentially significant. In 1799, French soldiers were carrying out routine work near Rosetta in the Nile Delta. They were strengthening Fort Julian and demolishing older sections of masonry to reuse stone and clear space. During this work, they uncovered a dark slab reused in the wall. It was damaged and incomplete, but what mattered was immediately obvious. It contained 3 separate inscriptions arranged in bands. The top section was hieroglyphic. The middle was demotic, the more cursive script used for daily and administrative Egyptian writing in the later periods of ancient Egypt. The bottom was Greek. That meant the same decree had likely been written in scripts and languages intended for different audiences. In practical terms, it meant one unknown system could potentially be compared against a known one. This was the missing key scholars had needed for centuries. The stone was not important because it contained secret doctrine. It was important because it contained repetition. The same message, expressed in multiple forms. That is what makes decipherment possible. Meaning becomes testable when equivalence exists. Once scholars recognized this, the problem of hieroglyphics shifted from mystical speculation to philological analysis. The question was no longer, what hidden symbolism might these signs contain? It became, how does this inscription correspond to the Greek text? And what structure of language lies behind that correspondence? That shift was enormous. It transformed Egypt from a symbolic fantasy into a solvable historical problem. The stone eventually passed into British possession after the defeat of French forces and was sent to London, where it entered the British Museum. But by then, the race to decipher Egyptian writing had already begun. Copies circulated. Scholars across Europe studied the inscriptions. The Greek text could be read immediately and identified as a decree issued in 196 BC during the reign of Ptolemy V. That alone established the broad context. The challenge was turning that known content into a tool for deciphering the unknown sections. Thomas Young made critical early progress, especially in identifying that cartouches, oval loops around groups of hieroglyphs, likely enclosed royal names. That insight helped show that at least some hieroglyphic signs had phonetic value. Jean-Francois Champollion, drawing on Young's work but pushing beyond it, recognized something more fundamental. Hieroglyphics were not purely symbolic and not purely alphabetic. They were mixed. They could represent sounds, ideas, and classifiers all at once. That insight changed everything. By the 1820s, the silence had been broken, and once it was broken, the consequences were irreversible. Egypt no longer existed merely as a dream of outsiders, a projection of Greek historians and Renaissance mystics. It began returning as a civilization, speaking in its own words. What had once been inaccessible walls of signs now became sentences. What had once been mute monuments became archives. And with that, one of the greatest recoveries of lost knowledge in human history had begun. Once hieroglyphics could be read, ancient Egypt stopped being a shadow and became a world. That transformation happened gradually, then all at once. At first, decipherment allowed scholars to identify names, kings, gods, titles, places. But once the structure of the language became clearer, the range of readable material expanded rapidly. Temple walls were no longer decorative mysteries. Tomb inscriptions were no longer symbolic fantasies. Papyri, stelae, coffins, monuments, and statues all began yielding information. What had looked like inaccessible beauty became historical evidence, and the amount of that evidence was overwhelming. Ancient Egypt had been writing for millennia. Once scholars gained access to that written record, they did not uncover just one lost story. They uncovered thousands: religious hymns, legal decrees, tax records, royal inscriptions, autobiographies, burial formulas, literary tales, love poetry, medical instructions, administrative correspondence, agricultural inventories, and diplomatic records all became available. Egyptology did not simply gain a new text, it gained a civilization's documentary memory. One of the first great changes this produced was historical correction. Before decipherment, much of what the wider world thought it knew about Egypt came through Greek and Roman writers. Those sources were valuable, but they were limited, biased, and sometimes confused. They described Egypt from the outside. Once hieroglyphics could be read, the scholars were no longer forced to rely mainly on external testimony. They could compare what Herodotus said against what Egyptian inscriptions actually recorded. They could reconstruct king lists from Egyptian sources. They could study political transitions from the perspective of those who lived through them. This gave historians something they had never truly possessed before: internal chronology. The names of pharaohs could now be placed into a more secure sequence. Dynasties could be linked with actual inscriptions rather than with later traditions alone. Battles, building programs, temple dedications, religious reforms, and succession crises could be understood through Egyptian records. The civilization stopped being a legendary past and became a reconstructible history. The change did not remain political. It moved quickly into religion. The Egyptian afterlife, for example, had long fascinated outsiders. Greek writers described burial customs, mummification, and temples, but their accounts were incomplete and often exoticized. Once funerary texts could be translated, a deeper structure emerged. The Egyptians had developed a rich and complex understanding of death, personhood, transformation, divine judgment, and cosmic order. The Book of the Dead was not one single book, but a body of funerary spells and formulas designed to help the deceased survive the journey after death. These texts, describe dangers in the underworld, the role of gods like Osiris and Anubis, the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at, and the moral dimensions of judgment. That mattered because it revealed that Egyptian religion was not crude superstition. It was a sophisticated moral and metaphysical system with its own internal coherence. It tied cosmic order to social order, ritual to kingship, and individual fate to larger patterns of divine balance. The dead were not simply buried, they were prepared for a metaphysical passage. Tombs were not just monuments, they were technologies of survival. The same was true in medicine. Egyptian medical papyri revealed treatments, observations, classifications of injuries, and pharmacological traditions based on plants, minerals, and bodily knowledge. Some practices were effective, some symbolic, some mixed, but taken together, they showed systematic attempts to understand the body rather than random trial and error. There were instructions for dealing with wounds, fractures, swelling, infection, pain, and obstetric problems. The Egyptians were not modern doctors, but neither were they primitive guessers. They were participants in a long tradition of practical knowledge. Mathematics and administration told a similar story. Tax records, land surveys, and accounting documents showed a civilization capable of large-scale organization. Mathematical texts revealed comfort with fractions, geometric calculations, and measurements necessary for architecture and agrarian management. Astronomical documents revealed careful observation of celestial cycles, calendars linked to the Nile and to Sirius, and systems of timekeeping embedded in ritual and governance. Then there was literature. This is one of the most important things the Rosetta Stone made possible, because literature changes how we imagine the past. A civilization seems distant as long as we know only its kings and monuments. It becomes human when we hear its voice in stories, songs, advice, jokes, grief, longing, and memory. Egyptian literary texts included wisdom literature, tales of travel and shipwreck, laments, hymns, and poems of love. In them, ancient Egyptians speak in tones that still feel recognizable. They worry about justice, they praise beauty, they mourn loss, they reflect on instability, they advise children, they complain about corruption, they remember absent lovers. The distance of thousands of years remains, but it is joined by something startlingly intimate, continuity of feeling. This is what the Rosetta Stone ultimately made possible, not just historical reconstruction, but recognition. Yet the stone's importance goes deeper still, because the decipherment process reveals something profound about language itself. The Rosetta Stone contains the same decree written in hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. That seems straightforward, but it raises a question that matters far beyond Egypt. If the same message appears in different languages, in what sense is it actually the same? Languages do not divide the world identically. They do not package meaning in exactly corresponding units. A translator does not simply substitute one word for another as though meaning were stored in interchangeable boxes. Languages carry structure, emphasis, category, and worldview. Some distinctions in one language are absent in another. Some concepts require explanation rather than replacement. Some ideas travel cleanly, others distort as they move. The Rosetta Stone exposed that reality. Its three inscriptions are equivalent in function, but not mechanically identical in expression. They correspond, but they do not mirror one another perfectly. That matters because it reveals that translation is interpretation. It is not only about transferring content, it is about rebuilding sense across different systems of thought. This is especially clear when translating religious or philosophical terms. Ancient Egyptian concepts such as Ka and Be do not line up neatly with modern ideas like soul or spirit. Translating them too literally risks flattening them. Translating them too loosely risks distorting them. The translator must choose whether to preserve strangeness or create familiarity, and either choice affects understanding. The same issue appears in government and law. Egyptian offices and institutions do not map perfectly onto Greek or Roman ones, let alone modern bureaucratic terms, If a translator uses an overly familiar word, readers may assume a false equivalence. If the translator leaves everything unfamiliar, comprehension becomes difficult. Translation always balances access against precision. That insight matters far beyond philology. It means that every recovered civilization comes to us through mediation. We do not simply open the past and read it as it originally was. We reconstruct it through grammatical analysis, contextual inference, comparative study, and interpretive judgment. The Rosetta Stone gave scholars entry, but entry is not the same as total transparency. In that sense, the stone did two things at once. It solved a mystery and created a discipline. It unlocked the language, but it also forced scholars to confront the complexity of reading across millennia. It taught that access to words is only the beginning. Understanding requires context, humility, and constant revision. And it raised a haunting possibility. If so much had been lost because one script became unreadable, how much else had vanished for the same reason? The ancient world is full of texts we still cannot fully read. Linear A remains undeciphered. Proto-Elamite remains elusive. Many fragmentary scripts sit in museums as preserved but silent records. Their civilizations have not disappeared completely. Their material traces remain. But without linguistic access, their inner world stays closed. The Rosetta Stone reminds us that human knowledge can survive physically and still die intellectually. A civilization may leave inscriptions everywhere and still become mute if the chain of transmission breaks. What is lost is not only information, it is perspective, voice, self-description, the ability of the dead to define themselves. That is why the stone matters more than almost any single artifact in modern intellectual history. It did not simply add data, it returned the agency to the past. What makes the Rosetta Stone extraordinary in the deepest sense is not only that it restored one civilization's voice, it is that it revealed the conditions under which all human knowledge survives or disappears. Civilizations often imagine their knowledge to be secure. They carve in stone, they build monuments, they create institutions of learning, they develop archives, priesthoods, schools, and systems of memory. And ancient Egypt did all of this. For thousands of years, it preserved ritual formulas, royal inscriptions, administrative records, and sacred literature. It encoded order into architecture, ceremony, and language. It seemed permanent, and yet permanence failed. The monument survived, but the reading tradition did not. The texts remained visible, but they became meaningless without interpreters. That is the Rosetta Stone's first philosophical lesson. Preservation of content is not enough. Knowledge survives only if the means of access survive with it. That lesson has enormous consequences. We often speak as though memory is stored in things: books, tablets, buildings, hard drives, databases. But memory is never in the thing alone. It depends on systems of decoding. A manuscript survives materially only if someone can still read its script. They understand its language and place it in its context. A digital archive survives only if future people retain the hardware, software, standards, and conceptual knowledge required to access it. Information without interpretation is only residue. This is not an ancient problem alone. It is a modern one. Today, humanity produces more information than any civilization before it. We imagine this makes our knowledge safer. In one sense, it does. Copies proliferate, networks distribute, backups multiply. But in another sense, it introduces new fragility. File types become obsolete, storage media decay, encryption outlasts passwords, platforms vanish, software ecosystems die. Future historians may possess vast amounts of our data and still be unable to reconstruct meaning if enough of the interpretive framework disappears. The Rosetta Stone forces a difficult question. What will be the unreadable hieroglyphics of our own age? Will it be data trapped in obsolete formats? Private archives accessible only through vanished systems? Scientific records dependent on lost metadata? Social communication embedded in platforms no future scholar can reconstruct? We tend to assume our abundance protects us, but abundance can create its own silence if intelligibility collapses. The second lesson of the Rosetta Stone is about recovery. Knowledge can be lost, but not always forever. That is one of the most hopeful truths in intellectual history. Egyptian writing disappeared as a living system, yet it was recovered. Cuneiform vanished and was recovered. Maya script was lost and, through patient decipherment, substantially recovered. What allows that recovery is not luck alone. It is a combination of survival, comparison, discipline, and persistence. A text survives. A bilingual inscription appears. A pattern is recognized. A scholar refuses to give up. A civilization begins speaking again. That process is both scientific and imaginative. It requires method, but also intuition. Thomas Young and Champollion did not simply stumble onto the answer. They combined evidence with willingness to abandon inherited misconceptions. For centuries, Europeans had imagined hieroglyphics as mystical symbols expressing ideas directly. The decipherment succeeded only when scholars accepted a more mundane but more powerful possibility, that hieroglyphics were, at least in significant part, writing in the ordinary linguistic sense. Once that shift happened, the problem changed from mystical symbolism to structured language. This matters because it shows how interpretation is shaped by prior beliefs. People do not fail to understand the past only because evidence is absent. They also fail because wrong frameworks feel beautiful, prestigious, or satisfying. Europe's fascination with mystical Egypt often prevented it from seeing actual Egypt clearly. The Rosetta Stone did not only provide missing data, it forced a correction in imagination. That is another reason the stone remains symbolically powerful. It stands for the moment when fantasy yields to reading. But reading itself is never neutral. Even after hieroglyphics were deciphered, scholars still had to confront the harder problem of interpretation. What does an ancient text mean within its own world? How much can translation ever preserve? Can a modern reader truly enter the mind of an ancient priest, official, poet, or scribe? Or are we always reading through our own assumptions? This problem has no final solution, but the Rosetta Stone sharpens it. Once direct access becomes possible, the burden of responsible interpretation grows. We are no longer excused by ignorance. We must now decide how to read voices from another age without collapsing them into ourselves. Modern scholarship tries to do this through context. Egyptian religion, for example, cannot be understood simply by matching each deity to a modern equivalent, or each funerary text to a familiar doctrine. The categories are not identical. Egyptian kingship cannot be treated as a normal monarchy with decorative theology attached. There is a function within an entirely different relationship between divine order, ritual power, land, and state. Even something as seemingly basic as personhood was configured differently through concepts like the body, name, shadow, K, and Bey. The Rosetta Stone therefore teaches humility. Decipherment is not possession. To read a civilization is not to own it. It is to enter into a difficult relationship with alterity, with a world that is intelligible enough to study, but distant enough never to become simple. That tension has become even more important in the age of artificial intelligence. Today, computational methods are transforming the study of ancient texts. Machine learning can identify scribal habits, reconstruct broken inscriptions, compare vocabulary distributions, detect formulaic structures, and trace semantic shifts across centuries. It can sort thousands of texts at a speed no human could match. In that sense, AI functions as a new kind of Rosetta mechanism, not a bilingual key, but an analytical amplifier that reveals patterns hidden at scale. Applied to Egyptian texts, such methods can expose regional variations in religious language, identify chronological changes in administrative vocabulary, distinguish textual traditions, and uncover structures of repetition invisible to ordinary reading. This does not replace scholarship. It changes its horizon. It allows ancient corpora to be approached not just text by text, but system by system. Yet here too, the Rosetta Stone's deeper lesson applies. Every tool, interprets through assumptions. AI can reveal patterns, but it cannot by itself decide what they mean. It can suggest relationships, but significance remains a human judgment shaped by training, theory, and care. A machine may cluster text together, but scholars still must decide whether the cluster reflects genre, theology, authorship, region, or merely artifact of the data set. The old problem remains. Access is not the same as understanding, which brings us to the final reason the Rosetta Stone matters. It changed not only what we know about Egypt, but what it means to know the past at all. Before its decipherment, ancient Egypt existed for Europe largely as a dream, magnificent, enigmatic, and voiceless. After the stone, it became a civilization with records, arguments, institutions, emotional lives, and internal complexity. The past became less mythical and more human. That is the true recovery. Not only names and dates, but humanity itself. We can now read labor records and see workers as workers, rather than as anonymous builders of monuments. We can read letters and discover disputes, anxieties, obligations, inheritance concerns, and personal appeals. We can read hymns and watch a religious imagination at work from inside rather than through hostile or admiring outsiders. We can read poetry and find tenderness. We can read legal documents and find power organized in detail. We can read tomb texts and hear fear, hope, and longing in the face of death. This is what lost civilizations really are. Not merely ruins, but interrupted conversations. The Rosetta Stone resumed one of the greatest of those conversations. And because it did, it became more than an archaeological object. It became a symbol of translation itself. A symbol of the possibility that what has gone silent may not be gone forever. A symbol of the fact that cultures do not vanish cleanly. They remain in fragments, waiting for conditions under which meaning can return. Its discovery was accidental. French soldiers were not searching for the master key to Egyptian civilization. They were demolishing a fort wall. The stone had survived because it had been reused, buried, and ignored. History often works like that. The great hinge points of knowledge are not always found through heroic intention. Sometimes they survive because something ordinary protected them by chance. And yet chance alone is never enough. The stone was found by accident, but understanding it required generations of discipline. Survival is accidental. Recovery is labor. That may be the final lesson. Can human beings lose worlds? Then sometimes through patience, comparison, imagination, and rigor, they recover them. Not perfectly, never completely, but enough to let the dead speak again. The Rosetta Stone did that for Egypt. It restored a language. It reopened a civilization. It exposed the fragility of memory, the difficulty of translation, the danger of false interpretation, and the astonishing resilience of human inquiry. It showed that a single artifact, if it contains the right relationship between languages and survives long enough to meet the right minds, can reverse centuries of silence. That is why it remains one of the most important objects ever discovered. Not because it is rare, not because it is beautiful, but because it proves us that silence is not always final, and that somewhere inside the ruins of history, our meaning can still be waiting for its key.